everything we possibly could. But 8 months after we opened, and we had decorated the center with Cuban posters. And the main poster was that big Cuba poster that you see at the beginning of the poster exhibit by my friend Raul Martinez. He had given me an original copy, hand silk screen, turn off your phone. and, but 8 months after we opened, 8:30 at night, the Spanish class had just left the center because we thought it was a good idea to teach people how to read our books. And so we were giving Spanish classes. And I was working alone. The Spanish class had just left. And suddenly a huge explosion went off in the center. And a not very thinking Cuban exile had put a huge plastic bomb in the center. And the first thing it got was that Cuba poster because the blast went bang right in front of the door, and that was the main poster hanging on the far wall, so it destroyed that poster. And I've never been able to get another original one or a copy, so it was very thrilling to come in and see that the first poster you see as you enter the walk of posters is Raul Martinez's original size poster, because that's how big the original was, So that's my story about the poster. And if you ask me anything you want.
And if you can imagine the fire department and Sandra having a showdown about what not to spray with water during that moment, I mean, I can't even imagine.
The firemen were coming in and I was saying, "Don't hose the books." I said, "Lady, there's a fire in here."
So I left out one major detail, which is you are the executive director of the Center for Cuban Studies in New York City. So that's a very important detail there.
Well, that's a 45-year job because when the day after the bombing, we held a press conference in the rubble, and one of the reporters said, I had taken the job for 1 year. It took a leave from teaching. And the reporter said, well, are you going to close the center now? And I said, absolutely not. And what's more, I'm not going to leave here until we have normal relations with Cuba. Thinking that it would mean getting rid of Richard Nixon, right? Nixon was toast and we would have relations with Cuba. I'm still there because I said that. So that's why.
So you are from the Midwest.
I was born in Minneapolis.
Right?
Thank you very much.
Born in Minneapolis. And Cuba's really far from Minnesota. So what year did you first start visiting, and what attracted you to Cuba?
Well, I think anyone who teaches politics or is involved in politics, I was very involved with SDS and a lot of other organizations. And I think, if you're interested in politics, you wanted to see the Cuban Revolution for yourself, I wasn't famous, so I didn't get invited at the beginning of the revolution. All my friends did. Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman, Tom Hayden, everybody went. And people would say, well, when are you going to go? I said, well, the only way to go legally is to be invited by the Cuban government, and maybe they don't know I exist yet. But in 1969, I was invited. That was 3 years before we opened the center. And at the time, I was teaching and also working for Ramparts magazine. And so I went down ostensibly to give a series of lectures on McCarthyism in the United States, which had been something I had studied a lot and written a little bit about. And so I went. You had to go through Mexico at that time. You had to go through a third country, let me say. So I went through Mexico. The Mexican government would not let you return. You could go, but when you're in Cuba, you might catch something that you could give to the Mexicans. So once you were in Cuba, you had to go return via Europe. And as an invited guest of the Cuban government, you went on Cubana Airlines. And at that time, Cubana went to only two places, Prague and Madrid. So I always came back via Madrid so I could keep studying Spanish. And that was the first trip. And on that first trip in '69, that was when I pulled my first poster off the wall, the one you've seen. Well, I mean, it was incredible to think that there were silk screen posters on the wall. You know,
That's a belabored process. I mean, it's a very complex process, and it takes quite a while. I'm not a screen printer myself, but I know that.
But I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about silkscreen versus offset in those days. All I knew is that was a great poster and it was on the wall in public.
I was going to say, it's probably no coincidence. A lot of your posters are from 1968, 69, 70.
Yes.
You were there during that time. And the one poster that I think you were referring to, Sandra, is right in Esker Grove. It's the Revolucion. And it was a series of 10 posters, each year representing a different year in the 10-year anniversary of the revolution. So 68 was a really pivotal year, not just in Cuba, but really around the world,
Of course,
especially,
of course.
you know,
And I
with
think
the
in
Cuban
part
Revolution.
because of the Cuban Revolution that happened. That series of posters actually originally, that was not one of the ones I took down. That was originally a small set. It was not that large. You know, later they produced it larger and put it on some billboards. But the one I tore down was a profile of Fidel and Martí. Although I didn't know that was Martí at the time. All I saw was Fidel.
And so I imagine you're in Cuba and you're, you know, seeing this country for the first time in the middle of this incredible moment in their history, taking posters off the wall, and then bringing them back to the U.S. and no one questioned it.
Well, they should have, of course, but on my second trip through Mexico, I found this gorgeous kind of ochre yellow leather duffel bag. And I said, this looks like a really good bag to carry to Cuba. Well, it turned out to be exactly the size of most of the posters. You know, in other words, after that time, I came back every time with at least 100 or 200 posters rolled up because the Cubans gave them away at that time, you know, and they fit perfectly in the duffel bag. And nobody ever questioned my coming back with those posters, which, of course, as I said, it was illegal at the time to bring in informational materials from Cuba.
Right, and you have so Sandra and the Center for Cuban Studies has a larger collection of Cuban posters than the National Gallery in Havana. And I wonder how much of that is the idea that maybe it wasn't considered art or some sort of valuable, you know.
I think that's partially true because after all, if you think about posters, what they come from is, in capitalism, is advertising and publicity. And it's not that graphic design didn't exist in Cuba before the revolution. It did. They had some wonderful graphic designers, but they were all used for selling. They were used to get people to buy things. And what happened after the revolution was that the reason for graphic design to exist changed. It changed from consumerism and trying to get people to buy to political propaganda, cultural propaganda, persuasive propaganda of all kinds. And it became a completely different item. And it became great art, in my opinion. You know, for me, it became great art.
And so have you had conversations with the National Gallery in Havana about, because I'm sure they've started to collect and are probably looking for a lot of these posters from, you know, the 60s and 70s that people weren't preserving in the same way that they would art at the time?
Well, I think the thing is that just as with self-taught art, posters by the National Museum of Fine Arts in Cuba were not considered art in the same way. So, for example, in the National Museum of Fine Arts in Havana, there are only 3 self-taught painters, right, of all the artists. And they do not have a permanent poster collection. They showed their first poster show, which was put together by Rene Mendez, who is the graphic designer who runs the design section in the Casa de las Americas, which is a very important cultural institution in Havana, and was started almost as soon as the Film Institute was started. And it was intended to be a place where artists, musicians, writers, actors, directors from all over the Americas, including the United States, they didn't count on us breaking relations, would come together and would work culturally together. So I think that that's part of the reason the National Museum doesn't have a poster collection. But Pepe put together, he's one of the best contemporary graphic designers. And when we go in the other room, you'll see some of his poster art, which is mainly done now, not so much for political reasons, but for cultural events. And I think, if people think that the posters were started with political intentions originally, that is incorrect. The first Cuban posters were really the cultural posters. The Film Institute, which was recognized immediately at the beginning of the revolution as an important part of the revolution, because you had to persuade people. You had to talk to them. You had to explain to them, what is a revolution? What does it mean? We're starting a new era in Cuban history, but how do we do it? We can't do it in a country that is, to a great extent, illiterate. The campaign against illiteracy wasn't until 1961, 2 years later. So posters, film, anything graphic became really important. The pictures were the 1,000 words kind of thinking. But it became, and that's how poster art became so important. I know what I consider, I know that it says something different. I think you consider the Eladio Rivadula poster of Fidel as the first poster. But the first real poster, I think, of the revolution was a black and white offset poster. And there was a small child seated on the ground, dressed very poorly. And the words at the top said, "Cuando yo sea grande," when I grow up. And then below it were all the dreams that the revolution had for the child. Very much like we were talking earlier about the quote from Fidel's speech, "History will absolve me," at the court when he was on trial. And what he said was, we made the revolution. Why Moncada? Why did we attack Fort Moncada? We made the revolution to ensure that every child will have an education, that every child will have health care, et cetera, et cetera. So that, I think, was the first real propaganda poster of the revolution. And it was just a little black and white poster, and it was a photograph of a poor child for his dreams, talking about his dreams.
And at the well, I don't know if at the beginning, but there were a lot of text and images that come together in a poster, and that's the work of a graphic designer, I think, is to make those synonymous with each other, and that the meanings intertwine. But later on, some of the posters that you'll see don't have any text, and the image is powerful and potent enough to really get that message across. So you'll see that as...
And also because the Cubans understood what those images meant. I remember we talk about a Fremis who changed graphic design forever in Cuba, because he was the first. He entered a poster contest. You'll see the poster. He entered a poster contest, and they said, "You can't enter the poster contest because there are no words on your poster." And he said, "The images speak for themselves." And they said, "You're crazy." But people finally decided that they would let him enter the poster contest. This was 1972. And he did, and he won. And you'll see why.
So Sandra, in these slides, has categorized the posters that you'll see here, some of which we have in person, which you can see, but she's categorized them into in person, in the flesh, in the paper. There's a couple of categories that she's explained. I'm new to Cuban posters, so she's really taught me these 3 categories. So the first is, do you want to go through? You go for it.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, these are just constructs, but we thought it was very important we actually have used a few more categories, but I think that shaping revolutionary culture is the first one, because I think it's the most important one. And they are the posters less frequently seen in this country. Obviously, the film posters are the most popular and the most often seen, because they weren't necessarily meant just for domestic consumption. They were sent abroad to advertise their films. But the ones that were made to change people's consciousness were only for domestic consumption. They were only to talk to the Cubans about the revolution. And so that's why we started with those. And then the performing arts and film ones are the ones, as I say, I mean, when we go in the other room, I've put together, just clipped together some images. We've got more than 600 film posters represented in the images that you'll see. And that's just a tiny, I mean, the Cuban graphic designer most popular at the Film Institute, Ikaik, I think Box alone made more than 3,000 designs in the years that he worked at the Film Institute alone. So when I say from all the designers, I've put together some images that amount to about between 600 and 700 film posters, because they made a poster for every film shown in Cuba, whether it came from China, the United States, Japan, Bolivia, Italy. You'll recognize a lot of films that you've seen, and they made them. And then, of course, one of the most important kinds of poster they made were the solidarity posters. And those were mainly published by OSPAL, which is the Organization for Solidarity with Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And those were posters that, for the most part, were not silkscreen. And they were not silkscreen because they were printed and offset, because they were folded and put inside of every issue of the magazine Tricontinental, which was published by OSPAL. They wanted everyone to have a poster. So you know that someone has an original OSPAL poster if it has creases.
So we're just going to go through a couple of these categories. Sandra, I know you have a story for each one, and I apologize in advance. I know. So we're going to start just with the shaping revolutionary consciousness. If you want to go ahead, and I'll
Okay, now
just
these were, and I've got this for you to, there are several copies to look at afterwards. Rene Mendez, who was a great graphic artist, made a series of 20 posters commemorating the attack on Fort Moncada, July 26, 1953. And these posters were done in 1973. So I wanted to show this one because this was a number of the comrades who were killed in the attack on Fort Moncada. And I've always liked what my friend Lincoln Cushing described as the bodies looked like autumn leaves fallen to the ground. These were all silk screen. And then
this is what you were referring to
yes,
earlier.
this is one of his last ones when Fidel is on trial and when he is speaking the tract that eventually became History Will Absolve Me, in which in the upper left-hand corner, although the posters had no words on them, in the upper left-hand corner, Medeiros quoted the quote from History Will Absolve Me in each of the 20 posters that he wanted to emphasize. And this was the one that he says, when Fidel answers the question aloud, why Moncada? Why did we attack Fort Moncada? And he essentially says the same thing as that first poster said. We attacked Fort Moncada to ensure that every child would have health care, that every child would have an education, that every person would have a roof over his or her head, etc.
And what year is this poster?
These posters were done in 1973 to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the attack on Fort Moncada. And this is the final one in the series where Fidel is victorious and is speaking to the masses. And this is in Revolution Square in Havana. This is one of my favorite posters. It's one of the glories of our collection because this was done during the literacy campaign in 1961. And at the end of the year and for a couple of years after, they held national meetings, which they called congresses, to discuss the literacy campaign, the meaning, because obviously from the very beginning, what the Cuban government said was, we cannot expect people to change everything about their lives and about the society and about the political structure if they cannot read and write. And so in 1961, what the Cuban government did was close the schools, which meant that many people who did not agree with the closing of the schools left the country at that time. It was also the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion, if you'll remember. It was also the time when many businesses, U.S. businesses, were being intervened by the revolutionary government. And so in that atmosphere, the Cuban government closed the schools and asked all teachers to go into the countryside to teach people who could not read and write to read and write. And they also asked for volunteers from the students. And any student who was 13 or older could volunteer to each one teach one. They had a little book that taught them how to teach people to read and write. I had a friend who was very tall. She later became, she was the wife of a Cuban diplomat to the United Nations, which is where we met. And she told how she had lied. She was only 11, and she had gone to volunteer, and they had let her volunteer because she looked like she was 13, even though she was only 11, and her parents were furious, but they did let her go. And then we held a conference in Boston on education, and we couldn't get very many Cubans to the conference. We did get the person in charge of the literacy campaign, however, Abel Prieto, who's the father of the current Minister of Culture in Cuba, and he worked with the Ministry of Education. But we couldn't get just, ordinary people who had signed up for the literacy campaign. In the Cuban mission was a man named Rene Mendez, who very embarrassedly said, well, I could go because I took part in the literacy campaign. I said, that's great. Where did you go? He said, well, I had to stay in Havana. My parents wouldn't let me leave. I was only 13. And I said, great, so who did you teach? He said, well, that's the problem. I don't know if it'd be good for your conference. I only had one student. I said, well, tell the story. And the story was wonderful. He said he went the first day to meet his student, and it was in a very elegant part of Havana, in a very big home with a swimming pool. And the father, who was a doctor, came to greet him. And he said, my son is almost your age, and he can't read or write. And Rene said, why not? And he said, well, we don't really know why. I mean, they didn't really know about dyslexia in those days, And he said, he taught him how to read and write. And he said he was never so proud of anything in his life. And that young man did not leave Cuba. He stayed in Cuba, and he became a doctor like his father, even though almost the entire family, which was upper middle class, did leave Cuba. And so Rene was very proud, and I love the story, Anyway, that's why that poster is great. And this is one of the most important posters, I think, of the early years. And again, I like it. We put it in right here because it simply says that education is a weapon against the enemy. And again, continuing that is very, very important. This poster represents the celebration after the Cubans defeated the invasion, our invasion of the Bay of Pigs. This was on the corner of 23rd and 23rd Street, and between 10th and 12th, Fidel held a rally right in the middle of the street. And what he said was, what the Americans cannot stand is that we're building socialism under their very noses. And basically everyone cheered. They had rifles, etc. I had this poster, it was done by Rene Mendez, the same one who did this. I had this poster in my apartment in New York. And I had lived in New York for about 3 years. The center wasn't open yet. This was the late 60s. And it was time for my apartment to be painted. Every 3 years, right? So I came home at 5 in the afternoon after my day of teaching at City College. And there were no painters there. And I went into my bedroom, and this poster had been slashed with a knife. You feel as though you've been raped. It was terrible for me. I said, what's going on? It turned out that one of the two painters was a Cuban exile. And he saw that and just, went nuts. I said, okay, please make sure that no more Cubans are sent to paint my apartment. I mean, it was still, for many Cubans, very raw. But that kind of violence, and of course, the bombing too was part of that, but this was earlier. So that was my little story. I told Jackie, I said, you have to put that poster in because I want to tell my story about the slasher. It was scary. This was the very first poster I ever took down off the wall.
So you can see the
Right?
Yeah.
It says Moncada, because my very first trip was the 4th of July, 1969. That's when I arrived in Cuba. So Moncada took place on July 26th. And basically what this says is that on the 26th of July, everyone is supposed to work, to show the dedication to the revolution. What we do is we don't go out and just have a carnival as they do in Santiago, but we're going to work. And that was on my first trip. That's what I did on July 26th. We went to work in the coffee fields. And I remember I was next to some Swedish women who the summer before had been working in Israel. And we were taking a break. And the Cubans had given us some yogurt and some juice to drink. And I asked the Swedish women, well, what's different about your experience in Israel and here in Cuba? Because you're doing the agricultural work, same. I said, oh no, it's not the same. You see, we've been sitting here for a half hour, and every time we start to get up, a Cuban comes along and says, no, descansa, here, have a little more juice. And, no, she said, after you're sitting in the fields in Israel, after 15 minutes, they come along and say, come on, back to work. So, but this was the first poster. This is another Raul Martinez poster done about the same time in 1968. I mean, Raul Martinez was a very well-known abstract painter before the revolution. But one of the things he had done was he had studied at the Art Institute of Chicago, and he had worked in advertising, U.S. advertising. So when the revolution came to power, he thought it was really important to stop doing abstract art. And he became the first pop artist of the revolution because he wanted to be able to communicate with his neighbors, with people who didn't know anything about art. And he worked very closely with his local CDR, the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. And all of these people are his neighbors, except for Che, and Jose Marti, but Fidel. But he put his neighbors into his pop art, along with the leaders of the revolution and the historical leaders. And he became famous for doing multiples of Cuban heroes, like Jose Marti. There's one Marti, then there are 12 Martis, because he thought it was important. He said, these people are already known to the Cuban population, but I want to tell them that they multiply, and they multiply, and they multiply. And by visually multiplying them, they will understand how important they are to our history.
And this is one where, if you walk away tonight learning anything about Cuban posters, Raul Martinez is probably one of the most names that I've seen the most of in the research I've done.
Yes, and and at the end of his life, he died in 1995. He went back to abstract painting because he felt he'd done his job, as a pop artist, and people in Cuba now